South clears away. And for many, it's looking like a bright day, with clearing skies then into the start of the weekend. A widespread frost for Saturday, but Saturday should be mostly dry and bright.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Hey, welcome along. It's the Mark Steyn Show, live on your telly and on your wireless, simultaneously and without breaking a sweat. Tonight, Jane Austen gets cancelled. We have more on our gutless politicians, but we also have an elected parliamentarian who's calling for a royal commission into the catastrophic errors of COVID policy, and seeking truth in a war zone. Plus, the one thing we can never get enough of, your questions and comments. Send them along to gbviews at gbnews.uk, or you can Twitter me at gbnews. All that coming up after Simon Pusey with the latest news.
Thanks, Mark. I'm Simon Pusey in the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister says the 1.25% rise in national insurance is unquestionably right for our country and the NHS. The increase means Britain's tax burden has now risen to its highest point in 70 years, impacting the income of millions of households. The government predicts £39 billion will be raised over the next 3 years. Boris Johnson says it will help reduce the NHS waiting lists.
The most important thing is to have a strong, robust economy in which you have a high level of security in your employment, in which people know that there's a long-term plan to deliver jobs and growth.
A security guard at the British Embassy in Berlin, suspected of spying for Russia, has been extradited from Germany to the UK. David Smith was arrested by German police last August and is accused of collecting information to pass on to the Russian state. The 57-year-old is expected to appear in Westminster Magistrates' Court tomorrow. Vladimir Putin's daughters are among those being sanctioned by the US over Russia's alleged war crimes in Ukraine. In a new round of sanctions announced this afternoon, the US says it is targeting Russian financial institutions as well as Kremlin officials and their family members. US President Joe Biden says in 1 year, American sanctions are set to wipe out the last 15 years of Russia's economic gains.
There's nothing less happening than major war crimes. Responsible nations have to come together to hold these perpetrators accountable. And together with our allies and our partners, we're going to keep raising the economic cost and ratchet up the pain for Putin and further increase Russia's economic isolation.
The Secretary-General of NATO has thanked the US for what he called outstanding leadership in the face of war in Ukraine. Welcoming the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken to the latest NATO summit, Jens Stoltenberg says the efforts from the US have been indispensable. The two met ahead of a meeting with foreign ministers today and tomorrow. Mr. Stoltenberg says the atrocities in Bucha reveal the true nature of Putin's war.
Killing of civilians is a war crime, and therefore, NATO allies are supporting the international efforts to establish all the facts, to investigate and to make sure that perpetrators are punished.
The Prime Minister says biological males should not compete in women's sports. Speaking during a visit to a hospital, Boris Johnson said to him it seems sensible. It's after he defended the government's decision not to include trans people in the proposed ban on conversion therapy. He added there were complexities and sensitivities which needed to be worked through. TV, online and DAB plus radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Mark Steyn.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon. The highest tax burden in 70 years. Gee, maybe next election they'll elect a Conservative government to do something about that. Well, it's the dog hours of the telly schedule. Nothing on, is there? We're all just killing time till Dan Wootton arrives to give it some Wednesday welly. So to get you in the mood, here's the clip I intended to start with yesterday, but it didn't work out. Dan had the brilliant notion to dispatch to the Palace of Westminster Ben Leo from GB News and get Ben to ask MPs and indeed multiple ministers of the Crown whether women have penises. Watch the massed ranks of the political class flee in terror.
One quick question that Sir Keir Starmer has struggled with in recent days. Can women have penises?
You'll have to ask the Prime Minister first.
What does he think? Do you know?
Don't know.
Doesn't take into consideration how women feel about it and women's rights. Surely it's a simple answer that women can't have penises? We're just asking if women can have penises. Is it something you'd like to elaborate on?
I don't know.
You don't know?
No, they can't, can they?
Can women have penises?
I'm not going...
I'm just asking people a simple question, whether women can have penises.
I'm not prepared to answer that because I don't know enough about the subject. But thanks very much for asking.
You don't know enough about men or women's simple biology? Can women have penises? Can women have penises? Sir, Ben from GB News, can women have penises?
That should get a BAFTA right there, and I mean that because you never see it on the Beeb or on ITV. In fact, I think at the BBC all the women have penises now, certainly at the Women's Hour unit. So that's why we need GB News for things like that, and you should keep that clip. Download it to your telephone, your fax machine, whatever, and play it regularly, because ultimately it's not about female penises, it's about a gutless political class too feeble to stand up even to obvious provocations. These are people, all the people you saw in the street just there outside the Palace of Westminster, these are people who claim to be able to change the very heavens, the global thermometer setting, if only they're allowed to tax and regulate us to their heart's content. That they can do, change the very heavens. But does a woman have a penis? Oh, no, that's out of my pay league. They talk tough on illegal migration at election time and then spend the next 5 years letting pseudo-refugees be taxed in by the Royal National Lifeboat Institute into the express check-in on England's southern shore for hotels and room service at your expense. But every time you hear a politician talking butch, you should play that clip of ministers and backbenchers too scared to give you an honest answer on female biology. Whether or not women have joined the phallocracy, there is a distinct lack of cojones in the House of Commons. They're scared because if they were to give the wrong answer, they might be cancelled. Well, that's the world you guys helped make. Any of us could be cancelled at any minute. I'm likely to be cancelled in about 20 minutes' time. On Monday's show, I noted that if you read carefully the latest report from the United Kingdom Health Security Agency, the numbers demonstrate the increasing uselessness of the vaccines, or what the Health Security Agency calls the, quote, rapid waning, which is probably one reason this UK HSA vaccine report is the very last they'll be issuing. Now, a tweeter tried to tweet that bit of Monday's show, and the Twitter commissars immediately pounced. This tweet can't be replied to, shared, or liked. Oh my! Even though all the numbers come from the ever so impressive sounding United Kingdom Health Security Agency, you're still not allowed to retweet that or share that tweet. Odd. Are you still allowed to sing A Land of Hope and Glory? I know the last night of the proms is very controversial these days, but I have dim memories of the second line being something about A Land of Hope and Glory, Mother of the Free. No wonder they don't want you singing it. How has Mother England, a crucible of liberty for centuries, degenerated into a crucible of compliance in which it is unacceptable to disagree with one official approved narrative? Britain has always had a more regulated broadcasting environment than, say, America, but social media are now taking it to the next level. You are forbidden to disagree. Your tweet cannot be shared or retweeted. Strange to be governed by men, and of course by women with penises, so insecure that they think their own official narrative is too flimsy to permit criticism thereof. Malcolm Roberts is a senator for Queensland, and he's not like those MPs we saw outside the Palace of Westminster. Here he is in Her Majesty's Australian Parliament.
The very least we can do for the victims of COVID vaccines is to say their names. Victims like Caitlin Georgia Gotts, a healthy and vibrant 23-year-old studying at Griffith University to become a vet while working as a horse strapper. Caitlin dropped dead at work of a heart attack following her second Pfizer shot. Her death was recorded as asthma, a condition Caitlin has never had.
So you've never been diagnosed with asthma, but your death certificate says you died of asthma? Senator Roberts is going to join us from down under later. Also coming up tonight, the cancellation of Jane Austen, because it's much better that our university students should be studying something way crapper than that. But first, there's a war going on. And we're now in a low-trust media environment, which is why I went to Ukraine to check it out for myself. And I certainly enjoyed my time in Ukraine. I like Ukrainians very much. However, in recent days, we've had reports of appalling war crimes on the ground. Reports of civilians, hundreds of them, shot dead by Russian troops, which have in turn prompted intensified sanctions today from Joe Biden and from other parts of the Western world. There are not many non-Ukrainians who know the situation as well as the former Portuguese cabinet minister and author of Geopolitics for the End Time. That's such a cheery title. I wish I'd thought of it myself. Bruno Massais. Bruno knows this thing from the Ukrainian end and from the Kremlin's end. And Bruno, I was reading your interview, a rather interesting one, with a former advisor both to Putin and to Yeltsin before him. What do you think the Kremlin's end game is here?
Hi, Mark. How are you? Well, Karaganov, the gentleman I interviewed, influential and close to Vladimir Putin, he's very clear about it. He wants effectively to destroy Ukraine as an independent sovereign state. Perhaps something called Ukraine, as he says, will survive, but it will be a much reduced state. And another section of Ukraine will come under Russian control in one form or another, perhaps nominally independent, but controlled from Moscow. In the end, a partitioned country, a fragmented country, a destabilized country, and a country that he hopes will disappear from history. I think that's essentially what Vladimir Putin has announced from the beginning. He doesn't think that Ukraine exists as a country, as a nation, as a state, and therefore, by right, it should disappear.
Now, I could go along with that if this was February 24th, because at that point, it looked as if Putin had a plan, that he would launch a blitzkrieg upon Ukraine, and if he didn't actually take Kiev, he would at least topple the government and get rid of its president. But instead, what we've seen is they're stalled. This idea of even taking Ukraine up to the Dniester River, they're not going to be able to do that. They haven't got the manpower to do that. They're actually being pushed back now. They're being pushed out of northern Ukraine. The Ukrainian military are retaking cities. And I put it last night, rather in a throwaway line, but I'd be interested in your take on it, that we all thought Ukraine couldn't win militarily, but that Joe Biden and the EU had ganged up and these sanctions would crush Russia. Instead, the sanctions seem to be largely ineffectual, and Ukraine is holding its own on the ground.
I think that's a fair account of what's happened. I don't know if they've been ineffectual. They've certainly been ineffectual in the short term. They haven't affected Russian conduct in any visible way. And it's, in fact, the Ukrainian resistance, which I saw when I was in Kiev just before the invasion. The whole country was prepared, was organized, was incredibly motivated. Everyone you met on the street was ready to fight and had a machine gun at home. And that kind of spirit is what allowed Ukraine to resist. And one can only imagine what would be the humanitarian catastrophe, the war crimes, the genocidal campaign, if Russia was in control of a larger section of the country. Now, you say that was never going to happen. I'm not so sure. Russia had two plans. They both failed. One was to send the paratroopers straight to downtown Kiev next to the government quarter and try to storm the palace, perhaps kill Zelensky. That failed. Then there was a second plan of laying siege to Kiev, surrounding the city. That also failed in large measure due to supply problems. And now they've reverted to something else that we don't know yet quite what it will be, probably a battle in the Donbass. But let's not assume that it was never going to happen. It's easy retrospectively to think that. It didn't happen because the Ukrainians were prepared. They received intelligence and they received weapons from Western countries, and that obviously was of critical importance as well. But history could have taken a different turn. And we know that the Americans were, for example, insisting with President Zelensky that he leave Kiev. If he had left Kiev, I don't know what the consequence could have been.
No, that's actually an excellent point, because, a lot of people don't like Zelensky, and they got I noticed after he was at the Grammys, people were saying, oh, enough already. But you're right that the Americans thought he was like these puppets they installed in Kabul, that as long as he could fill a helicopter with cash, he'd be interested in just skedaddling out of there and going somewhere else. But I'm wondering if the longer this goes on, can we shy away from the apparent contradiction on the oil and gas front, which means that essentially the West is funding both sides of this war at the same time as we're sending weaponry and other assistance to Ukraine. We're also enabling Putin to enable Russia to continue this war because we're still buying his oil and gas. So we're essentially funding both parties to the war.
Well, funding both parties, but actually in a disproportionate manner. The EU has provided Ukraine with about 1 billion in military equipment and has provided Russia with about 40 billion since the war started. 40 billion in energy resources. So 40 times the amount of support for Ukraine. And yes, I don't think that is sustainable. I don't think that's intelligible. I don't think it makes any political sense. There are two things that can weaken Russia: Ukrainian military resistance and banning energy imports into the EU. The rest, you just had a piece of news about sanctioning Putin's daughters. I'm not against it if it helps. And it's certainly a good symbol, but it's not going to affect Russian conduct. These two things are the two things that can affect Russian conduct. Ukrainians are delivering on their side. I don't think the EU and particularly Germany are delivering.
No, I think you're right there, that it may irritate wealthy Russians if you seize their daughters' ski chalets, but it doesn't make any difference to the conduct of what they regard as their national strategy. Now, you take a big global view of things, and that's one of the reasons we enjoy talking to you. Are you surprised at the way the so-called international community that Joe Biden talks about is basically North America, Western Europe, Australia and New Zealand, and that not only China, but India, South Africa, Latin America have steered clear of this and declined to join in with the Russian sanctions?
Yes, they have. In some cases, I think worse than that. India has declined to condemn the invasion. It has declined to blame Russia for the atrocities in Bucha. There are other examples, but certainly the Indian example is very striking. And what this reveals is that there's a lot of resentment against the West. And you have to be very naive, or you have to live in a parallel reality to think that that's not the case. It was created in some cases because of the Iraq War, because of the Afghanistan War. But in the case of India, it goes back centuries. That we're still living in a post-colonial world. And many of these regions in the world think that if the West is taught a lesson, that might not necessarily be a bad thing. Now, they may change their mind a little bit, I think, because as we get more and more accounts of these atrocities and war crimes, and as it becomes clear that Russia is not as strong as many people thought, I think we may start to see a little bit of a shift. We've already seen it in Pakistan, with, for the first time, some statements accusing and condemning Russia. But for the time being, you're right. There's a good chunk of the world community that is, at the very least, neutral on this matter.
Putin's whole shtick, his whole act, depends on him being perceived as a winner. That's what people like about him when he rides around bare-chested on horseback, and he's the tough guy, he's the winner. He's bogged down now. He's in a quagmire. We always say that about these wars, but it doesn't usually take as quickly as this to reach quagmire. If you wanted to give him an exit ramp out that would be attractive enough for him to end this thing, what would it be? What would the terms be that would make him back off and go home?
Look, Mark, I don't believe in this idea of the exit ramp. He's going to give up when he starts thinking that the risks are too high and that perhaps his position is in risk. That's when it's going to give in and retreat. Look, if you're in a bar fight and everyone in the bar fight provides you with an exit ramp, that you have a safe word and the fight stops, then you're going to be more aggressive because you know there's a way out. I completely disagree with this idea that an off-ramp is going to make things better. We have to keep the pressure, turn off the gas, resources and income, continue to supply Ukraine with weapons. And I think we may see some improvement in Russian conduct after that, not before, and no off-ramp in those terms, in my view.
Well, that's actually a fascinating, what you said, a safe word, which, if I'm right, is from the S&M bondage dungeons, is actually perhaps a better way of looking at it. And we're way beyond that now. Now, General Milley of the appallingly inept American chiefs of staff, I don't know why anybody pays any attention to a word he says this war's going to go on now for months, if not years. Do you agree with that, or do you think the Ukrainians can actually bring this to an end more quickly?
No, I agree with that. I think we're facing a frozen conflict. There will develop a certain line of contact between the two sides. There will be occasional flare-ups. In some limited areas, the line of contact may move in one direction or the other. There may be some intense battles here or there. But I think we're going to see a repetition of what happened in 2014, a frozen conflict, just in this case, on the scale of Ukraine as a whole. I don't see any of the two sides able to bring this to a clear, definitive conclusion. Unfortunately, I would wish to see a victory, but...
So although they can take back territory as they have done in the north, they're not going to be able to take back everything. So there will inevitably be some sort of frozen conflict just going on for a few years yet. That's a realistic assessment. But a depressing one nonetheless. Thank you very much, Bruno. We always appreciate your insight, and unlike most of the people blathering about this, you have actually been in Kiev and seen what it's like on the ground. Let me know what you think. GBViews at gbnews.uk. You can Twitter me at GBNews. Your thoughts on the passing scene up next on GB News. Stay with us.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children, and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls, and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate, and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Let's get to your comments. This is from a Twitter user, whatever you want to make of that. Oh, literally, as we speak, Mark continues to show he doesn't know how vaccines work. That's interesting, because they've sort of changed the definition of vaccines now. The South African study, for example, showed that 80% of it wears off after 2 months. So you've got a vaccine and then it's completely worn off after 2 months. That's not a vaccine, actually. That's like Viagra, just lasting a little longer. What is it they say on the ads for Viagra? If your state of arousal lasts for 6 hours, consult a doctor. Well, you can't get in to see a doctor, certainly not in a state of arousal. But that's basically what this is. If your state of protection from COVID lasts for more than 6 weeks, consult a doctor, because it's wearing off. 80% of it wears off after 2 months. Moaning, Twitter user continues, moaning that his fake news was censored on Twitter. He used to be smart. I'm not moaning at all. I couldn't care less. Twitter is a joke. Politicians who follow Twitter is a joke. But I'm always interested when the best argument that anybody has is you can't say that and we're going to remove your tweet. I've never actually tweeted. I've got a Twitter account. It's got, I think, just under 300,000 followers. I've only ever done one tweet. I did one tweet, and then the people who run my Twitter account took the keys away from me and said that was never to happen again. So I couldn't care less about Twitter. But I find it interesting that we are living in an age that is so insecure now that people just actually, could you turn off the talk back? I can't, I've got this echo coming through. We had this earlier. That's I've forgotten what I was saying now. Okay, let's go to Christine. I'm doing it out of order now because you put the talk back in my ear. Christine says, please do not keep saying your slot is just filling out time before Dan Wootton comes on. Have more confidence in yourself and your program. I can't do that, Christine. I'm riddled with self-doubt. And I was in the lift and Dan Wootton got in just as we were going up, and I said, hey Dan, it's great to see you. And he looked at me and he said, have we been introduced? Anyway, I'll try to. I'm riddled with self-doubt. I should have Julie Andrews to sing Because Which You See, I have confidence in me. Steve says most of the media took the government's 30 pieces of silver for the past 2 years. It's not news but propaganda. There are disturbing aspects to this. In Canada, for example, newspapers and television and so forth are all subsidized by the government, and it naturally creates a dynamic in which you want to restrict the range of views. It's not quite that bad in the United Kingdom, but as Sue Cook said the other day on this show, she was astonished to find that Ofcom were actually advising broadcasters not to broadcast anything at odds with the official public health narrative. This is England, the crucible of liberty. We shouldn't be doing things like that. Okay, one more. Let's see. Patricia, why is Boris Johnson always in a hospital when he makes a statement or has an interview? This is getting ridiculous. We seem to be dominated by COVID still. He wants you to think he's a doctor. He wants you to think he's an expert, a scientist, like Professor Pantsdown or those overnighted nincompoops he's always being flanked by when the COVID was big. He wants you to think he's one of them. That's why he should wear a white coat. He should get a stethoscope. It is a truth universally acknowledged that when a presenter begins a piece on Jane Austen with the words, "It is a truth universally acknowledged," it's because he's a lazy twit with nothing of interest to say. But of course, we live in a time when truths are not universally acknowledged, but swatted aside and replaced by more fashionable nostrums. Jane Austen herself has now been dropped by Stirling University as part of their plan to decolonize the curriculum. Ooh. Did you know? Oh, there she is on the £10 note. Why is she on the £10 note? She shouldn't be. Did you know she was a big colonizer? Actually, Jane Austen never set foot in any colony. She never left southern England. Bath, Hampshire, Oxfordshire, that was her entire world. The rest of it she heard about from her brothers, who were in the Royal Navy, a young Irish lad, Tom Lefroy, who conducted a flirtation with her, eventually became Lord Chief Justice of Ireland. But she never so much as ventured toward a Welsh ferry terminal, never mind heading to Scotland to check out the delights of Stirling University. Her geography is an anti-colony, just the county she was born and died in, and a couple of the surrounding counties. Alexander Lahmann is literary editor of Spectator World, and we're always pleased to see him. Alexander, this is as basic a cancellation as ever, the end of Jane Austen.
The end of Jane Austen, Mark. But I actually feel that it's more complicated than this, because what we've been ascribing to for a long time, as you say, it is a truth universally acknowledged that a dead female white author who has been in her grave for 2 centuries is very easy to ignore and very easy to put down with the debris of history. But actually what I think it is now is that Stirling University have said that Jane Austen is bad and Toni Morrison is good. But that's a very simple way of putting it. In fact, what I would say instead is that what Stirling are saying is that Jane Austen is not so much bad as irrelevant to what students these days expect. Because what they have essentially decided is that Jane Austen's views on matrimony, on finance, on society have nothing to say about the present day, whereas Toni Morrison obviously is somebody who has so much to say about the present day. But I think this is entirely untrue, because Toni Morrison is a fantastic writer, and anybody who hasn't read Beloved should read Beloved immediately, because it is one of those books that will genuinely make you see the world differently. But then so would Persuasion, and so would Emma, and so would Mansfield Park, which is by far Austen's most perspicacious book when it comes to the current issue. Because the thing about Mansfield Park is it is a book about colonialism. It is a book that entirely deals with what Sterling is so failing to get to grips with. It's a book that essentially confronts the slave trade head on. And what's quite surprising is that we think of Jane Austen as this very polite writer. We think of her as somebody who's perhaps slightly tame. We think of balls, we think of Bath, we think, he'll be whipped into shape. But actually, in Mansfield Park, we see in Sir Thomas Bertram, who is clearly meant to be a slave trader, we see this world in which it's quite different. We see actually the fact that Georgian wealth was based on the slave trade. We see the fact that there's a wonderful line in it, which is slightly rude, when she says, "Of rears and vices I saw enough," which on the one hand is basically a double entendre, but on the other hand it is essentially talking about the naval's colonialism, and it's the way in which we are looking at a world in which the British Navy was all-powerful. And of course, linked to the British Navy's power, we're talking about the way in which colonialism and the slave trade was absolutely something that sustained these balls and these marriages. But the trouble is now is that universities seem to be looking at these things in a very narrow way. And the Jane Austen House recently, I think 2020, had this exhibition which essentially revolved around the idea of Jane Austen and Black Lives Matter. And the trouble is with the concept of Jane Austen and Black Lives Matter is that you are yoking two entirely dissimilar things together for the sake of a headline. And it doesn't work, because Black Lives Matter is an angry constitutional thing, and Jane Austen is not. Which is not to say that Austen herself was not an angry figure. I mean, if you read her letters, if you actually read the novels as well, you see that with Austen there is an anger there. But it's an anger related to society, it's an anger related to women and how they're treated, and about the nature of how emancipation was essentially a problematic thing. Because, you talked about Tom Lefroy a moment ago, and Tom Lefroy was a man who was perfectly happy to go off and have flirtations with whoever he wanted. There was a film with Anne Hathaway and James McAvoy called Becoming Jane, which was entirely based around this. It was a silly, sentimental film. But what it did at least convey was the idea that Austen had an inner life. And she is not some sort of dull spinster who was able just to go off and write silly books about being single. And I think anybody who sees Austen like that is getting it entirely wrong. What makes me feel annoyed about Stirling University's decision to take her books off the curriculum is that they have essentially agreed with those who see Austen as inessential and those who see Austen as some sort of frustrated spinster, because she was never a frustrated spinster. She was a woman of remarkable literary gifts, a woman of extraordinary facility with the English language. And what concerns me is that not just Stirling, but other universities as well, have taken the idea that because her books are not written in a contemporary language, that they have to be somehow ignored and dismissed. And I don't see this as a post-colonialist thing. I see this purely as a sexist thing. I see this as the erasure of women from society. I see this as yet again another excuse to get a woman out of a world where people aren't comfortable with women having their views expressed. I think that's disgusting. I think actually that this should be called out far more than it is, because it's as if they feel that we have Toni Morrison, we don't have to have Jane Austen. I feel, but why do you have to erase a woman? Why does a woman's voice have to be erased from history? It's not right.
Just to take up that point there, Alexander. My problem with this, if you read, and setting aside, savage indictment of slave owners and, bitter spinster and all the rest of it. In fact, if you read Jane Austen, it's beautifully written so that almost anything else you study is not going to be as well written as that. So you are impoverishing the students who are entrusted to your care. And secondly, I think the reason she's lasted is because it actually, she's very funny. So there's a great psychological insight into the lives of, right from Northanger Abbey on, there's a great psychological insight into what it's like to be a woman in that time, which one would have thought would be of interest to women of other times. But it's almost as if, we're in such a present tense culture now, that because she has no position on whether transgender women should be competing in swimming championships, she's utterly irrelevant to our time. This is a stupid and reductive narcissism that says that nothing written before 2007 can speak to us.
What I would say to that is that ultimately we are in this era now where we have, on the one hand, had this primacy of female voices, and I think it's wonderful that we have so many amazing writers who are able to come through and to be taken seriously, because for decades I think that the literary world has patronised women and has seen them as merely the adjuncts to men. I mean, if you look at Virginia Woolf and Leonard Woolf, for a long time Virginia Woolf was seen merely as the wife of Leonard, whereas now, I mean, Virginia Woolf is seen as a feminist heroine, and who remembers Leonard Woolf? But I think what we are guilty of as a society too is that we are prizing the idea of irrelevance, and we are prizing the idea that just because somebody happened to say something, we must seize upon it, and we must think that that is something that is all important. And I think that what it comes down to with Austen is that you look at her oeuvre, and Northanger Abbey is a book which is far ahead of its time in terms of the traditions that she was dealing with. I mean, it's a parody of Gothic fiction. But it's also a book that is not a great book when you compare it to, say, Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre. And I think what worries me is that universities at the moment seem to be lumping everything in terms of you either have everything or nothing. And I think that's wrong. I think that what we should see instead is that we have to have balance. We have to take Austen and we have to have, I think, a reasonable literary criticism of her work. We need to be able to say, yes, Emma, Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, and of course Mansfield Park are major works. And indeed, many people would say that Northanger Abbey was a major work. But what I would say myself is that her value to the literary establishment is based much more in terms of what she was conveying. I mean, she was a woman living by her pen. And now that doesn't seem remarkable. But back then, that was seen as absolutely remarkable. The idea that she was nobody. I mean, she wasn't an aristocrat. She wasn't somebody who was able to go out there and convey that message to the world because she was so well known. She was a clergyman's daughter. And so what is really annoying me about this decision of Stirling University, and I'm sure other universities will follow, is that they are ignoring the fact that it is a woman's voice long, long before women's voices were generally being heard. And I feel that it's short-sighted. And it's as if you have decided that there is a short-term advantage to be gained by this very, 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 very small decision. And I can only hope that they will decide that they have made a mistake. But secondly, that other universities will not see this and think that Jane Austen should be consigned to history because she has so much to say about so many things that occupy us now. I mean, I'm sure if she saw GBNews, she'd be utterly thrilled by the fact that there is a plethora of voices, there are people who have things to say, they're not constrained by what they can say, and that they are able to talk about rears and vices as much as they want.
I'm not even sure she'd be looking at it in that way, Alexander, because the fantastic thing about Jane Austen is she did it just with words on paper. She lived in a different era. Nobody knew what she looked like, what they didn't know about her background. It wasn't a thing where she's tweeting all day long and then writing novels in between. It's just the writing, and the writing is worth reading because she writes a sentence like a dream. And unfortunately, a lot of these people who are kicking her out of the curriculum can't do that. Thank you very much, Alexander. Coming up, Ask Me Anything in Stump the Steyn. Also coming up, a rare politician willing to speak out on the COVID. Don't touch that dial.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children, and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Coming up on Dan Wootton tonight, after a damning Ofsted report reveals the shocking impact of lockdown on our children's development, who needs to be held accountable and how do we get our young back on track? Steve Chalk, founder of the Oasis Multi-Academy Trust, gives evidence to my lockdown inquiry. Plus, star US journalist Megyn Kelly, political firebrand Anne Widdecombe and columnist extraordinaire Rod Little give their unfiltered takes on the issues that matter to you, and I'll break down the headlines of the day with my superstar panel. Top Daily Mail columnist Amanda Platel, activist and entrepreneur Adam Brooks, and royal and political commentator Daisy McAndrew. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News.
Earlier on the show, I played you a clip of Senator Malcolm Roberts of Queensland speaking out on matters COVID in the Australian Senate and calling for a royal commission into what has been done in the name of public health. There aren't a lot of elected politicians willing to counter the official narrative in Parliament because one of the side effects of COVID-19 has been the implosion of effective parliamentary opposition. So I thought we ought to talk to Senator Roberts in hopes he might encourage some similar calls for a royal commission at Westminster or Ottawa or Wellington. Senator, good to see you. This specifically, your speech initially was opposing the vaccination of children 4 and under. Is Australia still planning to go ahead with that?
Well, first of all, Mark, I want to thank you for having me on your show. And secondly, I want to compliment you on your ability. You're still the finest speaker I have ever heard. I heard you speak in Brisbane and it was absolutely wonderful. You don't muck around. You just get right to the point and you brought in some humor. So I really appreciate it. I enormously respect you. And you've had the courage to take on Michael Mann and hold him accountable. That's wonderful. So you've been a hero of mine. Now, so far as the Parliament is concerned, this COVID, some people have died from COVID, but I've got the data from the federal parliament, from the chief medical officer in our country, Mark, and the data shows that COVID is low to moderate in severity, much less severe than some past severe flus. It's not high severity at all. We have completely mismanaged this. The government has completely mismanaged this. It's been absurd, it's been catastrophic, and it's been deceitful. They're the three words that come to mind when I think about COVID. And so there aren't many people who will speak up because we're following a global narrative. Just like climate change, we're following a global narrative.
But it's different here because with climate change, they're talking about sea levels in the Maldives in the year 22 whatever. But here, they're actually, the idea is that there's a one-size-fits-all vaccine for 7.5 billion people on this planet. And in fact, there are compelling reasons not to give it to huge numbers of that 7.5 billion, because in fact, if you're a 5-year-old child, you're at zero risk of catching COVID. If you do catch it, it's generally mild. You get the sniffles. There's never been in medical history, no one has ever proposed a one-size-fits-all 3-shot cure-all for the entire population of the planet.
Spot on, Mark. These injections, they're not vaccines. They are not vaccines. They're experimental gene therapy treatments. And they are very experimental. Our health minister, Greg Hunt, who is a graduate from the World Economic Forum program, he said, quite honestly, just recently, that the world is engaged in the largest clinical vaccination trial. Mark, I think drugs, if they've been tested properly, are found to be safe and effective and affordable and accessible, then they should be used. But if they're not tested, they should not be used, much less forced on people through mandates in this country. We have the Prime Minister repeatedly lying there are no vaccine mandates in this country. That is complete crap. It's a blatant lie. He's enabling the vaccine mandates in this country. What we've seen with this COVID mismanagement, it's a gross, catastrophic mismanagement. It's a destruction of people's lives. We've seen the deceit around the world. What we've really seen is this has never been about managing a virus, Mark. It's never been about managing the virus. It's about controlling people, using the virus to control people. And it's just another dance in the eternal conflict between control versus freedom. I don't see the world through left and right. I see it through control versus freedom. And always these monkeys are wanting to control the masses. And they're destroying our country. They're destroying the Western civilization.
Well, I can barely remember what it's like to be in your country, because one consequence of this is that they've generally used COVID to eliminate freedom of movement, which used to be, unless you had the misfortune to be behind the Iron Curtain, used to be as basic a freedom as any. Now it actually depends on whether you comply with a vaccine status and things. What I'm interested in here, and I'm just trying to expand the bounds of conversation about this subject. You said in your speech that there'd been a 50% increase in miscarriages for pregnant women in Australia, and I got some pushback from the production fellows who said, well, no, we've got this survey from the European agency or whatever that says there's nothing to worry about. And then I look at a survey out of a hospital in Haifa in Israel that shows that there's a 38% increase in stillbirth and miscarriage if you're vaccinated. What I find so puzzling is the way people like you, the minute you talk about these things, they say, no, you're not even meant to talk about it. What's up with that?
That's another form of control, Mark. The anti-social media is trying to control people. I've been taken off YouTube for daring to raise the word ivermectin. And ivermectin, wherever it's been used properly, has stopped this virus in its tracks. It's stopped the transmission. It's been a prophylactic to prevent people getting it. It's been wonderful. But instead, we've got these experimental gene therapy techniques that are killing people. So what it's all about is censorship. And when I tell the truth, if it doesn't fit with the narrative, then they call me names. And all I say in response, well, I know you do this too, is whenever you label me, you're admitting that you cannot counter my data, you cannot counter my facts, my argument, and therefore you resort to label. If you had the ability to counter my argument, you wouldn't use labels, you'd use data and facts. But the fact is that the injections are just a mechanism of control, and with the suppression of free speech in this country, the doctor-patient relationship, Mark, in this country has been smashed. It's a 3,000-year-old tradition from the Greeks, I believe. When people go to their doctor now, they don't get advice from a human across the desk. They get advice from the puppet masters behind the doctor, telling them what they can and cannot say. And we've seen doctors not reporting vaccine deaths, vaccine injuries. We've seen doctors afraid of giving people the honest advice on these experimental gene therapy treatments. And we've seen doctors disbarred from practicing medicine. One of the wonderful doctors we have here is a specialist in obstetrics and gynecology. He runs a fertility clinic, and he showed that, and obviously people who come to fertility clinics have difficulty getting pregnant. So he says that his data corresponds with the rest of the world, that about 13% of pregnant women have miscarriages. That's sad, but that's the reality of people in fertility clinics. He said, with vaccinated women, it goes up to 50%, and with vaccinated women in the first trimester of vaccination, if they were vaccinated in the first trimester, 75% miscarriage. These are facts that are just being ignored, and he's got to come up with a way now of getting them out into the public domain without being cancelled himself and being disbarred. He hasn't practiced himself for 7 months because he won't get the damn injection himself.
No, doctors actually say that they're told they can't disagree with the official narrative. As I said, it's very interesting when you have specific studies like this one out of Israel, that there is clearly some additional risk. And whether you want to argue whether it's 35%, whether it's 50%, whether it's 26%, that's something that a pregnant woman, I think, is entitled to know in order to give informed consent to these vaccines and all the rest. Let me just ask you quickly, Malcolm, one final thing. You've asked for a royal commission, and I certainly would like to see one. I'd like to see one in elsewhere in the Commonwealth. Do you think you'll get a royal commission?
Senator Pauline Hanson is the leader of our party, the One Nation Party in Australia. She is remarkably astute with politics and reading people. The previous Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, said we will never have a royal commission into financial matters. She twisted his arm and said, okay, and we've been calling for a royal commission into complete the finance industry in this country, riddled with corruption and abuse of people. So what she did was she said, Malcolm Turnbull, give us a Senate select inquiry into lending to rural customers. And she had him over a barrel, and he said, okay. Well, then what we did, Mark, was we went out into the bush and we listened to people and we encouraged them to make submissions. And then we went out into the bush and held hearings, Senate hearings in the bush. And I worked collaboratively, multi-partisan with the other MPs. And we ran that, and then we got all the data from the people who'd been ripped off. We then took it to the banks and smashed the banks in public. Then we smashed the insolvency practitioners. And as a result, the National Party, which is in coalition with the government, was so embarrassed that they told the Prime Minister, for goodness sake, get a royal commission into the whole financial structure or you'll be severely embarrassed. And that's exactly what happened. Yeah. We got the Royal Commission into the financial practices. There are many ways to skin a cat, and that's where that cat. Don't worry.
Yeah. Okay, that's great, Malcolm Roberts. At any time you can put egg all over Malcolm Turnbull's face is good for me. Do check out his full speech to Her Majesty's Australian Senate. That's going to do it for us. You know who's next? Dan Wootton will wallop you Wednesday. Stay safe, stay free.
Hello, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. It's going to be increasingly windy through the next 12 to 24 hours, turning colder with that wind coming from the north and northwest, and we'll see rain in some places, hill snow. The low pressure responsible for the wind is moving close to Northern Ireland, Western Scotland during the rest of Wednesday. Tight isobars on the southern flank of that low will bring gales to parts of northern and western Scotland, Northern Ireland, into these Irish sea coasts of North Wales, northwest England. Risk for some exposed parts of 60-mile-per-hour wind gusts, perhaps a touch more in some of the most exposed spots. Risk of disruption from that wind. But elsewhere, the wind is bringing colder air south. Some hill snow possible for Caithness, Sutherland, the Grampians, a few centimetres above 300 metres. That could also